The auctioneer's voice was a flat, metallic drone, a human machine turning a man's life into dollars and cents. Jedediah Stone stood by the old cottonwood at the edge of his own farmstead, a place his grandfather had broken with a team of mules, and watched it all get dismantled. He felt a cold hollowness in his chest, the kind that comes after the fight is over, and you've lost so completely there's not even anger left, just a quiet, echoing emptiness. Lot number 42, the John Deere 4020, 19 and 68 model, diesel, synchro range transmission. Good rubber on the back, fellas. This was his pride and joy. Who'll give me 10,000 to start? 10,000. 10. 10. Now 9. Who'll give me 9? Jed knew every scratch and grease stain on that tractor. He'd rebuilt the injector pump himself on the shop floor 2 winters ago. The smell of diesel fuel so thick in the air his wife Martha had made him strip on the back porch for a week. He could still feel the precise torque of the head bolts, the satisfying click of the feeler gauge when he'd set the valve lash. It was more than a machine. It was a partner. It was the tool that had turned his sweat into a crop, year after year. A hand shot up from the crowd. Richard Sterling, of course. Sterling stood there in a clean seed corn cap and a new denim jacket, looking like he'd just stepped out of a magazine. He hadn't farmed more than 10 years, but he farmed with the bank's money, and he farmed big. Got 9,000 from Mr. Sterling. Now 9,500. Who'll give me 9,500? The auctioneer rattled, his gaze sweeping the crowd of grim-faced farmers. No one moved. They were here like vultures, to pick at the bones. But most of them knew Jed. They knew he was a good farmer who'd just been caught on the wrong side of a bad year and a worse banker. They wouldn't bid against Sterling, who was buying up the county. Sold for $9,000 to the man in the green cap. Sterling didn't even look at Jed. He just made a note on a pad and turned his attention to the next lot, Jed's 6-row planter. One by one, the pieces of his operation, the tools of his self-reliance, were knocked down and sold off. The gravity wagon, the chisel plow, the old Farmall H his father had bought brand new in '48. Each slam of the gavel felt like a shovelful of dirt on a coffin. The worst part was the land, the home quarter section, the 160 acres that held the house, the barn, the sweat of 3 generations of stones. When the auctioneer started the bidding, a hush fell over the crowd. This was the main event. Sterling opened the bidding high, a power move designed to scare everyone else off. The banker, a man named Henderson with a soft face and hard eyes, stood near him, smiling faintly. Jed had sat in Henderson's office just a month ago, hat in hand, pleading for an extension on the operating loan. He'd talked about the drought, the low corn prices, the unexpected medical bills for Martha. Henderson had listened patiently, steepled his fingers, and then explained the realities of modern agricultural finance. "The numbers are the numbers, Jed," he'd said. Now, Sterling was buying Jed's legacy with Henderson's bank's money. The irony was so thick Jed could taste it, bitter as rust. When the gavel fell on the land, a low murmur went through the crowd. It was over. Jed Stone, whose family had worked this ground since before the Great War, was landless. Martha came and stood beside him, her hand finding his. She didn't say a word. There was nothing to say. They watched as Sterling sauntered over to the banker, shook his hand, and then finally looked over at Jed. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, not of sympathy, but of conquest. In that moment, Jed felt a flicker of the old anger, hot and sharp, but it was quickly smothered by the sheer weight of his defeat. A few weeks later, the hollowness had settled into a dull, permanent ache. They were living in a small rental house in town, and Jed was picking up odd jobs, fixing equipment for other farmers who were still hanging on. It was humiliating work, tuning up the very machines that used to be his rivals in the field. One Saturday, he drove his old Ford F-100 out to a consignment auction at the edge of the county, a place that was more junkyard than sale barn. He was looking for a cheap set of wrenches to replace the ones that had been sold with his toolbox. The auction was a chaotic affair, piles of scrap iron and derelict machinery baking under the August sun. The air smelled of hot metal, weeds, and leaking gear oil. He was rummaging through a pile of rusty hand tools when he saw it, tucked away behind a collapsed shed, almost swallowed by a thicket of sumac and wild grapevines, was a monster. It was an articulated four-wheel drive tractor, bigger than anything he'd ever seen up close. Its paint, what was left of it, was a faded, chalky lime green. Rust bled from every seam. Two of the massive tires were flat, the rubber cracked and split to the cords. The windows of the cab were shattered, and a bird's nest was tucked inside the exhaust stack. It looked like a dinosaur that had laid down to die. He pushed through the weeds, his boots crunching on broken glass. A faded decal on the side of the engine cowling was barely legible. Steiger. Bearcat 2. He'd only ever seen pictures of these beasts in the farm magazines. They were built up in North Dakota, tough as nails, meant for the vast wheat fields of the plains. This one was a long way from home. He pulled himself up onto the operator's platform. The cab was a wreck. The seat was torn to shreds, stuffing spilling out like guts. The gauges were all clouded and cracked, but the fundamentals were there. The massive levers for the transmission and hydraulics felt solid under his hand. He looked at the engine. It was a V8, and from the shape of the valve covers, he guessed it was a Caterpillar, a 3160 most likely, big, thirsty, and powerful. He knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that this was a fool's errand. The machine was junk. It would take thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours to even see if the engine would turn over. He had neither. But standing there, on the deck of that forgotten giant, he felt something he hadn't felt since the auctioneer's hammer fell. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something smaller, harder. It was a flicker of defiance. Sterling and the bank had taken his clean, well-maintained 40-20. They had taken his land. But this was something they would never touch. This was scrap. This was a forgotten relic that nobody wanted. And maybe, just maybe, he could bring it back to life. Before we go any further with Jed's story, I have to ask you something. Many of us have a machine like that in our past. A first car, a first tractor, a piece of equipment somebody else wrote off as junk. What was yours? What was that old, forgotten piece of iron you poured your own blood, sweat, and tears into, just to hear it run again? Drop a comment down below and tell us about it. I read every single one. The auctioneer finally got around to the back corner, late in the afternoon, when most of the serious buyers had already left. All right. Lot 347. What you see is what you get, folks. Big old Steiger tractor. As is, where is. No guarantees it'll even hold itself together on the trailer. We're selling it for scrap value. Who'll give me $500 for the whole works? Silence. The handful of remaining bidders looked at the rusted hulk and shook their heads. $500 was a lot for a tow bill. Come on, fellas. The axles and the planetaries are worth that. Who'll give me $300? $300? Jed's heart was pounding. He had $412 in his pocket, his entire net worth. $200 for a whole tractor, the auctioneer pleaded, his voice laced with theatrical desperation. Jed's hand went up. It felt heavy as lead. I got $200 from the fella in the back. Now $250. Who'll give me $2.50? He held his breath. A scrap man with a greasy beard looked the tractor over, spat a stream of tobacco juice, and slowly shook his head. "Sold! For $200, the auctioneer cried, pointing a finger at Jed. "It's all yours, mister, and good luck to you." Getting the Steiger home was the first impossibility. It took him a week to find a trucker with a lowboy trailer, willing to haul it for what little cash he could offer. They spent a whole day winching it out of the weeds, the sound of snapping roots and groaning metal echoing across the field. When they finally got it back to the small machine shed he was renting behind his house in town, it looked even worse than it had at the junkyard. It was a monument to failure, and the whole town knew it. Richard Sterling drove by slowly in his new Lincoln Continental the day after it arrived. He didn't stop, but Jed saw him shake his head, a little smirk playing on his lips. The message was clear. Jed Stone, once a respected farmer, was now just the town fool, playing with scrap iron. The scorn was a constant, low-grade fever. At the co-op, men would stop talking when he walked in. "Heard you bought that old green monster from the consignment sale," one of them said, not unkindly. "What in God's name are you gonna do with that thing, Jed?" "Gonna make it run," Jed said, his voice quiet but firm. A few of them chuckled. They meant no harm, but it felt like a slap all the same. They were all struggling, all caught in the same squeeze between rising costs and unpredictable markets, but they were managing. Jed was the one who had failed, and this tractor was the proof. It was his white whale, a rusty green obsession that everyone saw as the final act of a desperate man. He ignored them. He worked. Every night, after a long day of fixing other men's machinery, he'd go out to his shed, flick on the single bare bulb hanging from the rafters, and confront the beast. The first order of business was the engine. That Caterpillar V8 was the heart of the machine, and if it was seized or cracked, the whole project was a waste. He spent 2 weeks just cleaning away the grime and nests, soaking every bolt he could see with penetrating oil. The smell of it hung in the air, sharp and metallic. He drained what was left of the oil from the pan. It came out like black sludge, thick and gritty. A bad sign. He pulled the valve covers. More sludge. It was like the engine was filled with tar. The previous owner hadn't just run it hard. He'd neglected it to death. He needed to turn the engine over by hand to see if it was seized. The crankshaft pulley bolt was massive. He put a 4-foot breaker bar on it and leaned into it with all his weight. Nothing. The engine was locked up tighter than a banker's fist. Any sane man would have quit right there, called the scrap man, and taken the $100 loss. But Jed wasn't sane anymore. He was driven. He pulled the injectors, poured a mixture of diesel fuel and transmission fluid down into each cylinder, and let it sit for a week, hoping it would seep past the piston rings and break the rust's grip. While he waited, he worked on the rest of the tractor. He aired up the good tires and wrestled the 2 ruined ones off the rims. The tires alone would cost more than he had, so he put that problem aside for later. He started tracing the hydraulic lines, brittle and cracked from years of sun exposure. The electrical system was a nightmare. Wires chewed by mice, insulation crumbled to dust. He meticulously labeled each wire with a piece of masking tape before he disconnected it, filling a tattered notebook with diagrams. After a week, he went back to the breaker bar on the crankshaft. He put a pipe over the handle for more leverage and pulled. The pipe bowed, and a low groan came from the engine's guts. It moved. Maybe a 1/16 of an inch. It was the most beautiful thing he'd heard in months. For the next 3 hours he worked the engine back and forth, a tiny fraction of an inch at a time, feeling the rust and grime slowly breaking their hold. Finally, with a great shudder, it completed a full rotation. The heart wasn't dead. It was just sleeping. The next 6 months were a blur of greasy labor. He pulled the heads, wrestling the heavy cast iron off the block with a chain hoist. The cylinder walls were scored, but not deeply. There was a visible rust ring at the top of each one. He'd have to hone them. He pulled the pistons and rods, labeling each one. The bearings were shot, worn down to the copper. The crankshaft, thankfully, looked okay. He took the heads and the block to an old-school machine shop in the next county, a dusty place run by a German named Schmidt, who cared more about precision than profit. Schmidt looked at the parts, grunted, and said, "Will cost you." Jed laid out his plan. He'd do all the cleaning and disassembly himself. He just needed the block hot-tanked and magna-fluxed for cracks, the cylinders honed, and the heads resurfaced. He would pay in installments, with money earned from his side jobs. Schmidt, who had seen his share of hard times, looked at Jed's grease-stained hands and calloused knuckles and agreed with a nod. Piece by piece, the engine came back together on a stand in his shed. New rings, new bearings, new gaskets. He painted the block the proper caterpillar yellow, a bright spot of hope in the sea of rust. When the time came, he lowered the rebuilt engine back into the massive green frame. It was a milestone, a small victory that no one else saw. He felt a surge of pride that was worth more than any crop he'd ever harvested. He was not just fixing a machine. He was rebuilding himself. The years from 1972 to 74 were a strange time. A wave of prosperity, or at least the illusion of it, swept across the Midwest. The Russians bought American grain by the shipload, and commodity prices shot through the roof. Corn went from $1.50 a bushel to over $3. For farmers who were leveraged, it was a golden age. Richard Sterling was king. He'd used the land he'd bought from Jed as collateral to borrow even more, buying 2 brand new John Deere 4630s with the sound guard cab, air conditioning, and a tape deck. He bought the 80 acres next to his new parcel, then another 120 down the road. He traded in his combine for a new 7700, a gleaming green monster that could eat 8 rows of corn at a time. His operation was the model of modern, aggressive farming. He was featured in the county paper, standing in front of his new grain bins, talking about expansion and efficiency. "You got to spend money to make money," he'd say at the elevator, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The old ways don't cut it anymore. Get big or get out." He'd sometimes glance over at Jed, who was waiting in line with his rusty gravity wagon, pulled by his old Ford truck. The glance wasn't hostile, not anymore. It was pitying. Jed kept his head down. By the spring of 73, the Steiger was alive. He'd rebuilt the transmission, a massive Clark power shift, learning its intricacies from a tattered service manual he'd sent away for. He'd rewired the whole machine, installed new gauges, and patched the fuel tank. He found a pair of used, mismatched tires that would hold air and mounted them himself, a back-breaking job that took 2 full days. The first time he fired it up, the whole shed shook. The Caterpillar V8 bellowed to life in a cloud of blue and black smoke, a deep, throaty roar that rattled the windows of his rental house. Martha came running out, a dish towel in her hand, a look of shock on her face. Jed sat in the cracked seat, a wide grin splitting his face. The sound was raw power. It was the sound of a second chance. He couldn't afford to buy land, but he found a farmer on the verge of retirement who was willing to rent him 200 acres of rolling, clay-heavy ground that nobody else wanted. It was tough soil, hard to work. A Fortau 20 would struggle on it. But the Steiger didn't even notice. Jed bought a used 24-foot field cultivator and a big 7-bottom plow for pennies on the dollar at another auction. The equipment was old and ugly, but it was heavy steel. He worked that ground with a fury. The Steiger, with its four-wheel drive and massive weight, pulled the plough through the clay soil effortlessly. It burned fuel at a terrifying rate, but it did the work of two smaller tractors. While Sterling was sitting in his air-conditioned cab listening to the radio, Jed was wrestling with the stiff levers of the Steiger, covered in dust. The roar of the engine vibrating through his bones. He was making money. Not sterling money, but enough. The high grain prices meant that even on his marginal ground, he could turn a profit. Every dollar he cleared went into a separate account. He didn't buy a new truck. He didn't fix up the rental house. He kept his equipment running with salvaged parts and his own ingenuity. He was paying his bills and slowly, painstakingly, building a war chest. The community saw him as a man stuck in the past, a relic himself, unable to keep up with the times. They saw Sterling's shiny new equipment as the future. Jed saw something else. He saw the debt. He knew what Sterling was paying for his new tractors. He knew what the interest rate was on that operating note. He saw the new pickups, the vacation Sterling's family took to Florida, the new wing they added to their house. He saw a pyramid built on borrowed money and the assumption that $3 corn would last forever. One evening in the late summer of '74, he was at the co-op settling his fuel bill. The manager, a weary man named Frank, was listening to the news on a small transistor radio behind the counter. The announcer's voice was grim, talking about the oil embargo, inflation, and a man named Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve. Interest rates on prime lending expected to top 12% by the end of the year. The voice crackled. Frank shut the radio off with a sigh. Can you believe that? 12%. My first home mortgage was 5 1/4. Jed nodded, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. It'll hit the operating loans soon. Tell me about it, Frank said, shaking his head. The bank's already telling me my floor plan interest is going up 2 points next month. Some of these young fellas, they're leveraged so high, I don't know how they'll cash flow it if corn drops 50 cents. Jed paid his bill in cash and walked out into the cool evening air. He looked out across the flat, dark fields, the fields that had once been his. He could see the yard lights of Sterling's massive farmstead glowing on the horizon, a beacon of prosperity. But Jed didn't see success. He saw a fuse being lit. The boom times were a party, and Richard Sterling was dancing his heart out. But Jed could hear the music starting to fade, and he knew, with the chilling certainty of a man who had already lost it all once, that the banker would soon be coming to collect. The first sign of trouble was the sky. The summer of 1979, it simply forgot how to rain. The corn, which had stood so tall and proud in June, began to curl its leaves inward by mid-July. A desperate, thirsty gesture. The clay ground on Jed's rented fields baked and cracked into a mosaic of hard grey plates. The big Steiger had the power to pull the cultivator through it, but the dust it raised was a choking, constant cloud, a tan fog that blotted out the sun and coated everything in a gritty film. Jed would come in at night looking like a ghost, his face caked with dirt, only the skin around his eyes pale where his goggles had been. Across the county, on the prime black dirt that had once been Jed's, Richard Sterling's operation was also suffering. His center pivot irrigation systems, another massive investment, hissed and sprayed day and night, but they were pulling from a rapidly dropping aquifer. His power bills were astronomical. At the grain elevator, the talk turned from expansion to survival. The price of corn had softened, but it was the price of money that was truly terrifying. The evening news spoke of the Federal Reserve in hushed, ominous tones, and interest rates, once a stable fact of life, became a wild, unpredictable beast. The real crisis hit Sterling that fall, during harvest. He was running his new John Deere 7700 combine, a technological marvel with a 6-row corn head, pushing hard to get the drought-stunted crop out of the field before a storm rolled in. Jed was a mile away, chugging along in a used Gleaner F2 he'd bought for cash and rebuilt over the winter. It was smaller, slower, and louder, but it was simple. Suddenly, Sterling's combine shuddered to a halt in the middle of a pass. A high-pitched alarm screamed from the cab. He shut everything down, his heart pounding. A cascade of warning lights blinked on the console. Hydraulic pressure failure. Header lift controller fault. He climbed out, his boots sinking into the dry soil, and stared at the silent green behemoth. He knew how to change the oil, how to grease the fittings, but this was something else entirely. This was a problem of circuit boards and solenoids, a language he didn't speak. He called the dealer on his new mobile radio, a luxury that impressed the neighbors. The service manager's voice was strained. "We're swamped, Richard. Can't get a man out there till Thursday at the earliest. Sounds like the main hydraulic control module went out. We've got 2 on back order already." Thursday was 3 days away. The forecast was calling for a massive thunderstorm, with high winds, by Wednesday night. 3 days of watching his crop, his entire year's income, stand vulnerable in the field. He slammed his hand against the huge rear tire in frustration. The machine he had paid over $100,000 for, the symbol of his modern efficiency, was nothing more than a giant green paperweight. From his rattling Gleaner, Jed saw the 7700 stop. He saw Sterling get out and pace. He kept on with his own work, the steady mechanical rhythm of his simpler machine a comfort. An hour later, Sterling's pickup truck tore past on the gravel road, heading towards town, a plume of dust trailing behind him like a banner of defeat. The cracks were showing. Sterling had built an empire on the assumption that everything would work perfectly, that the dealer was always a phone call away, and that the money would never stop flowing. But the sky had turned against him, and now his own machines were betraying him, too. That night, the storm hit. It wasn't a gentle rain. It was a violent, horizontal assault of wind and hail. Jed and Martha stood on their porch, watching the lightning illuminate a sky boiling with dark clouds. The wind howled like a freight train, and the hail came down like stones, first the size of peas, then marbles, then golf balls. It hammered against the tin roof of the shed, a deafening, metallic roar. Jed thought of his old Steiger, safe inside, and then he thought of Sterling's crop, still standing in the field. The next morning, the world was battered and broken. Tree limbs littered the roads. The cornfields were a disaster. What the drought hadn't withered, the hail had shredded. Stalks were snapped in half, the ears of corn beaten to the ground, lying in a pale, ruined mash. Jed's fields were hit, but his crop was already mostly in the bin. Sterling had lost over half of his. It was a devastating blow, but the knockout punch was yet to come. It came in a crisp white envelope from the bank. The letter from Henderson was polite, professional, and utterly ruthless. Due to the new prime lending rate, now hovering near a staggering 18%, the interest on Richard Sterling's variable rate operating loan had been adjusted accordingly. The payment schedule would have to be recalculated. A meeting was required. The boom was officially over. The great party of the 70s had ended with a hangover of biblical proportions. All across the heartland, the same scene played out in 1,000 different ways. Farmers who had been hailed as innovators and businessmen just a few years before were now staring at balance sheets that didn't add up. The numbers, as Henderson had once told Jed, were the numbers. And now, the numbers were a death sentence. Sterling's empire collapsed with astonishing speed. The crop insurance barely covered his fuel and chemical bills from the spring. The catastrophic harvest meant he had nothing to sell to make his new loan payments. His credit at the co-op was shut off. The parts dealer put him on a cash-only basis. His shiny new equipment became a liability, a daily reminder of the millions in debt it represented. He tried to sell one of the 4630s to raise cash, but the market was flooded. Everyone was trying to sell. Used equipment prices plummeted. A tractor he'd paid $60,000 for was now worth maybe $25,000, while he still owed $40,000 on the note. He was trapped. Jed watched it happen from a distance, with a heavy sense of inevitability. He heard the stories at the diner, at the parts store. Sterling had sold his small cattle herd. Sterling had let his hired man go. Sterling's wife was now working as a clerk at the grocery store. The pity that had once been directed at Jed was now aimed squarely at the man in the big house on the hill. The final grim act came in the spring of 1982. A notice went up in the post office, printed on cheap yellow paper. A foreclosure auction. The property of Richard and Sarah Sterling. To be held on site, Jed stood and read the list of equipment. The John Deere 7700 combine, the two 4630 tractors, the planters, the plows, the discs, and at the very end of the list, the land. 160 acres. The home quarter. His home quarter. Jed went to the bank the next day. He wore his cleanest pair of overalls and sat in the same chair where he had once pleaded for his own survival. Henderson looked older, his face etched with new lines of worry. The banking business wasn't as fun when you were foreclosing on half the county. "Jedediah," Henderson said, forcing a smile. "What can I do for you?" "I'm here about the Sterling auction," Jed said, his voice level. "I want to know the reserve on the home quarter." Henderson's smile faded. He shuffled some papers on his desk. "That's a private matter between the bank and our client. I have the full amount of my old loan, plus interest, in a cashier's check in my pocket," Jed said, letting the words hang in the air. "I saved it. I never spent a dime I didn't have to. I paid my bills and I put the rest away. While your man was buying new pickups, I was patching tires. While he was in Florida, I was overhauling a transmission. I'm not here to ask for a loan. I'm here to buy my land back." Henderson stared at him, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. He had written Jed off years ago as a failure, a relic. Now that relic was sitting across from him, solvent and steady, while his star client was drowning. "The debt on that parcel is considerably higher now, Jed," Henderson said weakly. "With the improvements Mr. Sterling made, the new grain bins." "The bins are on a separate note," Jed stated flatly. "I checked the filings at the courthouse. I'm interested in the land, the 160 acres my grandfather homesteaded." The day of the auction was a mirror image of his own, but colder. It was a grey March day, with a raw wind that whipped across the barren fields. The crowd was bigger this time, a somber gathering of neighbors who knew this could just as easily be them. The mood wasn't predatory. It was mournful. This wasn't just one man's failure anymore. It was a community's crisis. Richard Sterling stood by his new, empty grain bins, his shoulders slumped inside his denim jacket. He looked thin, defeated. His wife was not with him. Jed saw the banker, Henderson, standing near the auctioneer's truck, looking uncomfortable. Jed didn't stand at the edge of the crowd this time. He walked right up to the front, positioning himself where everyone could see him. He saw men who had chuckled at his rusty Steiger look at him now with a newfound respect. They all knew Jed was debt-free. They all knew he had weathered the storm. In a world turned upside down, Jed Stone had become the safest bet in the county. They sold the equipment first. The big, modern machines went for a fraction of what Sterling had paid. The 7700 combine, with its still faulty electronics, sold for a shocking loss. Each slam of the gavel was an echo of Jed's own ruin, but today it sounded different. It sounded like justice. Then came the land. "All right, folks, here's the one you've been waiting for," the auctioneer began, his voice lacking its usual enthusiasm. "The home quarter section. 160 acres of the finest black dirt in this county, with house and outbuildings. Who'll start the bidding?" An uneasy silence fell over the crowd. This was the heart of the matter. This was the legacy. Jed let the silence stretch out. Then he raised his hand. 100,000, he said, his voice clear and strong, carrying on the wind. It was a solid, fair offer, based on the land's real value, not the inflated prices of the boom years. A murmur went through the crowd. Henderson, the banker, nodded grimly to the auctioneer. It was enough to satisfy the bank's primary lien. The auctioneer looked around. "I've got 100,000. Who'll give me 105? No one moved. They looked at Jed, then they looked at the broken man standing by the grain bins. They understood. This wasn't just a sale. This was a restoration. This was the closing of a circle. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, his gavel striking the block with a sharp crack. "For $100,000 to Mr. Jedediah Stone." Jed didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the banker. He walked straight over to Richard Sterling. Sterling wouldn't meet his eyes, staring instead at a spot on the gravel driveway. "Richard," Jed said quietly. Sterling finally looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed. "You came to gloat, Jed? Go ahead. You earned it." "No," Jed said, shaking his head. "I came to get my home back. There's a difference." He paused, the cold wind whistling around them. "The bank will want you out of the house by the end of the month. But I'm not the bank. You and Sarah can stay on through the summer, give you time to figure things out. I'll rent it to you. For $1 a month." Sterling stared at him, his mouth slightly open. He looked for malice, for sarcasm, for the twist of the knife. But he saw none. He only saw a quiet, profound sense of dignity in Jed's weathered face. "Why?" Sterling finally managed to whisper. "Because I know what it feels like to stand here and watch it all get sold," Jed said. "And because this county's lost enough good farmers, no sense in losing one more if we can help it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn key. It was the key to the workshop. "And I'm going to need a hand this spring. That old gleaner needs some work before planting. I'll pay you a fair wage." Tears welled in Richard Sterling's eyes. He nodded, unable to speak, and took the key. In the years that followed, the farm crisis deepened before it finally broke. Many more yellow auction notices were tacked up in the post office, but the Stone farm was an island of stability. Jed farmed his land, the land that was truly his, paid for with cash. He never borrowed another dollar from a bank. He and Richard, against all odds, became something like friends. Richard worked for Jed for 2 years, his arrogance replaced by a quiet humility. He learned from Jed how to weld, how to diagnose a mechanical problem, how to listen to the sounds of an engine and know what it needed. Eventually, Richard and his family moved to a nearby city where he got a job as a diesel mechanic, putting his hard-won knowledge to good use. Jed's old Steiger became a local legend. It was ugly, loud, and it belched smoke. But it always ran. When a neighbor's newer, more complex tractor went down, it was often Jed who would show up with the Steiger and a tow chain or with his toolbox to help them get running again. He never asked for money, just a cup of coffee and the satisfaction of solving a puzzle made of steel and iron. Years turned into decades. Jed and Martha grew old on the farm. Their children grew up and had children of their own. One grandson, a boy named Daniel, spent every summer he could with his grandparents. He loved the smell of the workshop, the feel of a heavy wrench in his hand, and the stories his grandfather told. One warm afternoon, in the late summer, Jed, his hair now white as snow, stood with Daniel beside the old Steiger. The lime green paint was almost completely gone, replaced by a patchwork of primer and the noble patina of rust. But the Caterpillar engine still started on the first try. "Grandpa," Daniel said, running his hand over a massive tire, "why'd you keep this old thing? You could have bought a new one years ago." Jed looked out over the fields of corn, green and healthy, rustling in the breeze. He looked at the house his grandfather had built, the barn he had re-roofed himself, the land that held the sweat of 4 generations. "This tractor isn't just a machine, Daniel," he said, his voice a low rumble like the engine he loved. "It's a reminder. It reminds me that what you build with your own 2 hands, what you understand down to the last bolt, what you own free and clear, that's the only thing that's truly yours. The bankers, they can sell your land. The weather can take your crop. But what's in your head and what's in your heart, they can't ever touch that." He placed his wrinkled, grease-stained hand on the boy's shoulder. "Some people chase dollars. They think that's what makes you rich. But the real wealth is in this," he said, stamping his foot on the solid ground. "It's in the soil. It's in knowing how to fix what's broken. And it's in ending the day tired and clean, owing nothing to any man." Daniel looked from the ancient, powerful tractor to his grandfather's clear, steady eyes, and for the first time he began to understand. The wind sighed through the cottonwood tree at the edge of the farmstead, the same tree where Jed had stood and watched his world fall apart so many years ago. Now, it was the sound of peace. It was the sound of a legacy, lost and found, a lesson learned in iron and rust, and a life, like the old tractor itself, rebuilt to last